September 1926, a hail of gunfire is heard on the road outside the headquarters of the Southside Gang in Cicero, Illinois. The machine ordnance rings out and the Hawthorne Inn is peppered with 1,000 shots, each with the same target, ignominious Southside gangbanger Al Capone, but the mob master escapes. Formerly further that they are guided by luck, security measures, or by his snitches. Capone seems insurmountable, at least for now. The man known to history as Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on the 17th of January, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, in the United States of America. His father was Gabriel Capone, a hairstylist who immigrated from Angeria, a small ville just outside of Naples in southern Italy, with his woman, and Alphonse, his mama Teresa Capone. Born Teresa Raiola, a needlewoman who will have 9 children with Gabriel. The couple arrived in Brooklyn in 1893, having first immigrated to the harborage of rejection in Austria. Hungary present day Croatia, their first hearthstone being 95 Navy Street in the Cortege Yard area of town Brooklyn, before moving on to Park Slope in Brooklyn when Alphonse was 11. Alphonse Capone had 8 sisters and sisters Vincenzo, who became a Prohibition agent, changing his name to Richard Hart Raphael James, known as Bottles, who would go on to control his family's liquor conglomerate. Salvatore, known as Frank, would also work for his family. Her family Amina, who failed at the age of 1. Amino, known as John, as well as Albert Matthew, and a surviving family Mafalda Capone. When he started academy, Alphonse showed pledge as a pupil, bringing home excellent results to his proud parents, but he plotted keeping the rules of his strict unqualified background and would be expelled from academy at the age of 14 for striking a womanish schoolteacher in the face, and so after this incident his formal training stopped, but his education into the felonious world was just beginning, girdled by felonious influences which sounded an everyday part of life in Brooklyn at the time. It was no surprise when L also graduated to gang life, joining small-time gangs similar as the Bowery Boys and 40 Steelers, after which he joined the Brooklyn Rippers and ultimately the 5 Points Gang, the most important gang of the time, which was grounded in Lower Manhattan. By 1917, AL's employer and tutor was Frankie Yale, who was a courier and pretension blackmailer who demanded payments from original businesses in order to cover, rather not harm them, and from the finances from his protection operation he opened up a bar called the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, where L worked for Frankie as a bartender and gatekeeper, but he was also learning knowledge, perceptivity, and the workings of the felonious world from them at the same time. But also the people who told him at this time were the further restorative characters similar as gangbanger Johnny Torrio, who he came to respect aphorism as a tutor. It was during this time that L would gain the surname. He abominated Scarface when he was working as a gatekeeper at the Harvard Inn and got into a fight with the original gangbanger, one Frankie Galluccio, after inadvertently disturbing his vivacious and beautiful family Lena by affronting her with a misgauged compliment about her posterior, and in the performing crapulous set to Galluccio slashed Capone with a cutter, which would leave a conspicuous scar on the left side of his face for the rest of his life. Capone was always conscious of this scar. I would have photos taken from the other side to avoid it being seen. He also claimed it was a war crack gained from, quote, a German gunner in the fosses of World War I, although this wasn't true as he'd no way served in the war. Still, a more favored surname for Al was one given to him by his closest musketeers, which was Smokey, a name for a smart dresser, and as well as this other aliases he was given included Big L, Big Boy, and Public Adversary Number 1. Following this incident with Frankie Galluccio, Capone was painting for vengeance, although he was forced to attune with the original villain rather by other high-ranking mobsters, which he did. Galluccio apologized for causing the scar, and Capone promised not to seek retaliation against him, which he stuck to. Indeed, when he became a mob master himself, one reason L decided to attune with Galluccio was that he honored his own fault in the matter, and so that Galluccio was simply esteeming and guarding his own family, and such a law would be a potent factor in how gangland families operated at the time, as family respect and fidelity would be crucial to how these mobsters lived. Despite operating outside of the law, in effect, they had their own moral law, or law, which they saw as sacrosanct. Indeed, family was everything to numerous Italian American mobsters of this time, and so when L's gal made Josephine Conklin birth to L's son Albert Francis Sonny Capone in December 1918, the only thing to be done was for the brace to Marie, which they did only a many weeks laterally. On the 30th of December, May had been working in an original department store when she met Al, and when he married this Irish unqualified girl, he was only 19 and she was 21, and so because he was under the legal age needed, he to gain the concurrence of his parents in writing in order to marry, but their marriage would be a veritably happy one right up until the end. Shortly after his marriage to May, Al was asked by Johnny Torrio to make the move to Chicago, and Al was happy to oblige his friend as well as make a new launch for him at his family in the Windy City, and so in 1919 Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago and began working as a bouncer in a cat house where he contracted syphilis, and it appears with hindsight the treatment with a recently introduced medicine called Salvarsan could presumably have cured him, but it seems that I will no way sought treatment until it was too late. The reason for the now notorious surge in organized crime across the United States in the 1920s was in large part due to the continued demand across the country for alcohol despite its trade and being substantially illegal under the 18th correction to the United States Constitution of 1919, as well as the Prohibition or Volstead Act that was ratified in January of 1919. There had been a growing clamor for the barring of alcohol across the United States since the 1800s, especially amongst the further prim Protestant Christian members of the population whose juggernauts against the trade of liquor came more and more oral and forthright as the decades passed, and was led by particularly hot temperance sympathizers similar as Carrie Nation, who came notorious in 1900 for embarking on a divinely ordained rage of violence across Kansas, in which she smashed up multitudinous bars with jewels and hatchets, claiming that God had told her to do so despite the further militant contenders against alcohol, numerous of whom were women who had suffered at the hands of crapulous misters. A case for reform grew and grew until ultimately 46 states, most of whose politicians and officers were now under massive pressure to pass the 18th correction, ultimately gave him meaning that by the morning of the 1920s the trade and consumption of the vast majority of alcoholic potables was illegal in America. Nevertheless, numerous people, especially those of Italian and Irish background or heritage, had no intention of abstaining from alcohol consumption, and so it was not long before a massive black request assiduity sprang up across America, which played directly into the hands of the thankful demi-world who decreasingly made a fortune from shipping and dealing liquor across the country in defiance of prohibition. Meanwhile, life with the Capone family in Chicago was going well, and in 1923 L bought a small house at 7-4 for South Prairie Avenue in Park Manor on the south side of the megacity for $5,500 and began making his name as a boxing protagonist, but this was simply a cover, as in reality he was working for a crime association headed by Johnny Torrio, who in turn had taken over from Chicago crime master James Big Jim Colosimo. At that time, at the height of the Prohibition period, the Chicago Outfit, or South Side Gang as it was also known, was a growing lawless association conforming of illegal stills and breweries and a transport network that reached Canada, defended through backhanders by politicians as well as law enforcement agencies. As well as this, the chatter was also grown through fear, with businesses who refused to buy the lawless liquor being blown up, and it's allowed that as numerous as 100 people could have been killed in similar bombings during the 1920s. Capone had a drive off for the high life, wearing precious bespoke suits, smoking cigars, or eating only the stylish food. He also had a relish for womanish company and was also known to wear precious grabby jewelry, and he burrowed in the attention he entered, similar as being cheered at his appearance at ball games, and felt he was a ultramodern day Robin Hood, making charitable donations from his vast lawless wealth. But when questioned about his conditioning and life, his falsely humble response might be, quote, "I'm just a businessman giving the people what they want, or all I do is satisfy a public demand." It seems he'd become a celebrity before celebrity had been constructed. Nevertheless, in 1923 a change had come about in the form of political reform, as in Chicago the reformist William Emmett Princess was appointed mayor, and to avoid implicit hindrance and disquisition, Capone and Torrio decided to move their base of operations to the Chicago cities in the city of Cicero, Illinois, and so Al Capone paced himself and the rest of the South Side Gang there. From where he grew the operation, they set up lawless bagnios, speakeasies, and gambling dens, and expanded the liquor operation to supply all of Cicero bars, indeed using bribery and intimidation to take over original city choices similar as the 1924 Cicero external choices, and of this veneer of respectability made it delicate for the North Side Gang to get to him, and was an occasion for Capone to not only cover himself from rival gangs who sought to take over his running monopoly, but also help the election of further reformist politicians. The peremptory mayor of Cicero was the loose Democratic Stolzad Diary, who on with his bipartisan administration had entered hardly any opposition in the choices, running Cicero by also for 3. During successive terms, the loose administration had been controlled by the South Side Gang with the help of an old family, Salvatore E. Capone, more known as Frank, but in 1924 the Democratic Party decided it would mount a challenge and run its campaigners in the election. Serious challenge to the status quo with their trouble to clean up the city. The 1st of April 1924 was the date set for the election, but Diary had decided he demanded help to secure a palm, as how he offered the Chicago outfitting. Effective impunity from execution, and Cicero Capone and his cronies were only too happy to oblige and brought in 200 men, members of his gang plus members from other Confederated gangs, and the contingent gathered included Capone's sisters, Frank and Ralph, as well as his kinsman Charles Fischetti. The gang would begin a targeted crusade of pecking, blow-ups, hijackings, and general intimidation to make sure that Diary was tagged mayor formally again, and to achieve that they started on the 31st of May, the dusk of the election, with the popular designee for city clerk William K. Palmer, who had his face beaten and his services ransacked, as well as this his woman was thrown against a wall. The terror continued the following day, the 1st of April, Election Day, when the choosers faced submachine ordnance and sawed-off shotguns at the polling cells to ensure that their votes were cast for Clinton. When their votes were for him, they were allowed to bounce multiple times, but those who dared to repel their persuasion breath averted from voting or beaten. As well as this, buses were roving the thoroughfares filled with markswomen, and several individualities were targeted, similar as Democrat Rudolph Hurt, who was standing for mayor, whose crusade headquarters was scattered with gunfire, and his fellow Democrat, the challenger for city clerk, was dynamo whipped in front of his family, as well as his sympathizers, and also in the crusade headquarters of another opponent, Frank Capone himself beat up several crusade officers and ransacked to the office. The chaos continued, with polling stations being raided and ditty snared from choosers' hands. Other choosers were indeed shot or picked or beaten by so-called flyweights in the road. Last, one crusade functionary called Joseph Price was tied up and gagged before being bombarded by the mobsters. Another popular functionary named Stanley Steinkovich was taken to a Chicago basement, blindfolded, and kept there until after the polling stations had closed to help him from advancing. Up to 20 others were chained to posts and pipes in the basement of a plumbing store to help them advancing, and a police officer was beaten after being disarmed of his gun. One Democratic contender named Michael Gavin was shot in both of his legs and kept with 8 other crusade workers in the basement of a mob-possessed Chicago hostel to help them advancing, and when a call from help from the contenders eventually reached Cook County Judge Edmund Pinaraki latterly that autumn, he transferred 70 Chicago police officers made up of 5 outfits of investigators and 9 outfits of police and vehicles to help subdue the chaos and confusion in Cicero. The police response included a squad auto carrying both uniformed police and investigators who spotted Alice's family, Frank Capone, as well as henchman Dave Headland and Charles Fischetti, and straightaway the Bobby jumped out of the auto with drawn munitions, and a gun battle replaced between the men, in which Frank Capone was shot and killed and Headland was wounded, but Al Capone escaped, as did Fischetti. Latterly surrendered himself. Capone gave his family a burial that was lavish and opulent. The flowers, handed by original courier and florist Dino Banyan, bring $20,000 alone, and the mourners wailed for the loss of one so youthful, but observing from a distance were the veritably same police officers who had shot and killed Frank Capone there, conceivably to evoke a response from the mob master, but it did not come, at least not at the burial. An occupational hazard for Capone in his time as master of the mob in Cicero was the numerous attempts on his own life from other gang members, as well as the trouble of arrest at any time. His bribery and corruption of original politicians shielded him to an extent that he and his cortege was still vulnerable, and so I was veritably security conscious as a result. Indeed, in the early 20s, Capone's motorist was set up, tortured, and boggled at vice, hardly escaped from an attempt on his life in the Chicago Loop, the business quarter of town Chicago. Capone's friend Johnny Torrio had taken over from Colosimo after he was killed on the 11th of May. 1920. Hayes was a murder which numerous believed at the time Capone was involved with, but in his new part, Capone put his New York nous to good use by negotiating in gang war dissensions and creating covenants between the colorful groups, getting known as an adjudicator of feathers. Likewise, the deals were made so that Torrio's Italian systematized crime group would remain the biggest in the megacity, and one of the most prominent of the deals that Capone brokered was a deal over the control of home between the ignominious North Side Gang and the Jenna Sisters. The Jenna Sisters were confederated with Torrio, as was Dino Banyan, head of the North Side Gang, who were a group of mixed-race culprits, and the sisters had begun dealing cheap booze to Bunyan's guests. And not only did Torrio feel to ignore what was going on, he also either sanctioned or arranged himself for the murder of O'Banion at his flower shop, which was the legal front to his own lawless operations, on the 10th of November. 1924, where he was shot whilst flipping chrysanthemums by Brooklyn crime master Frankie Yale and Jenna marksman Albert Anselmi. And John Scalise O'Banion had been known for his crazy, just a childlike wide grin and Banks laughing. Anyone knew he met he'd plugged down a man in front of crowds for no good reason and killed a man he met at AL's club, the Four Deuces, bringing unwanted attention to the mobsters. But when he tracked Torrio into being present at his brewery when he knew a raid was about to do which ended in Notorious arrest. O'Banion's boasting of what he'd done sealed his fate. This redounded in a change of the scale of the North Side Gang, and it was now headed by Vice with the help of his alternate in command, Vincent Drew. Crucial and Bugs Moran, and as O'Banion had been a good friend of Vice, the Northsiders had only one thing on their mind by this point, and that was vengeance. For this was just the morning of what would be a five-time gang war between the two coalitions. So in January 1925, it came as no surprise when first Capone was ambuscaded, leaving him unharmed, but shaken up by the experience, and also only 12 days later, Notorious himself was shot. When returning from a shopping trip, the experience leaving him deeply affected, he decided to effectively abdicate and in control of the Chicago outfit as it was known to Capone. At the age of only 26, there was a farther attack from the North Side Gang on the 20th of September, 1926, when they tried to draw Capone to the window of his Hawthorne Inn headquarters. Several markswomen opened fire on the first bottom of the eatery, with Thompson's submachine ordnance firing over 1,000 shots, but Capone was unharmed and called for armistice, followed by accommodations, which took place but achieved nothing. Only 3 weeks after this, the head of the North Side Gang, Vice, was killed by the South Side Gang outside the flower shop that had been possessed by Dean O'Banion, which now acted as the North Side headquarters of the gang. And in January 1927, the proprietor of Hawthorne's Eatery was a good friend of Capone's, was killed in retribution by Bugs Moran and Drew. Crucial, after being abducted by them, the durability of the turf wars urged a farther security measure when Capone began spending further time down from Chicago, and it wasn't unusual for the whole Capone cortege to turn up at a Chicago train station and hire a complete Pullman slumberer auto to take them on colorful breaks to places similar as Little Rock, Hot Springs, Kansas City, Omaha, or Cleveland for a week in a luxurious hostel, which they reserved using false names as a further endless retreat. Capone bought a 14-room mansion in 1928, and it's said that Capone paid $40,000 to August Bush, a beer mogul from Missouri, for this retreat at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island in Biscayne Bay, Miami, Florida. But the house would not be registered in his name, neither would any other property. In fact, he did not indeed have a bank account, but rather he used Western Union for cash deliveries. Nevertheless, he was a fat contributor to charity and indeed helped set up a Hayes Kitchen in Chicago during the Depression. All moves intended to bolster his fashionability with the common people. During his life, Capone used political alliances to his advantage. For illustration, he supported William Hale Thompson with a donation of 250,000 bones when the Democratic seeker for the 1927 mayoral election for Chicago suggested in his crusade that he'd allow illegal drinking bars to be restarted, which would obviously be a major occasion for Capone's illegal bootlegging business to thrive. After this, Thompson beat his reformist rival William Imadeva and became mayor of Chicago in 1927 and continued to admit the support of Capone, which allowed their mutually profitable relationship to continue right over until 1929, an event which latterly came known as the Valentine's Day Massacre was to crack Capone's thin veneer of legality altogether and would also jeopardize the informal impunity from police execution he'd enjoyed through his alliance with Thompson. Nonetheless, Bugs Moran was a nuisance on the side of Capone and an abominated adversary, and now leader of the North Side Gang following the death of Jamie Vice, and there was no love lost between them from either side because, as well as being competition for each other's bootlegging operations, Moran disliked the fact that Capone was involved in harlotry discordances as it was against his unqualified principles, and so the continuing tit-for-tat killings and violence came to a head on the morning of Thursday, the 14th of February 1929, the day of the Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone had incubated a plan against Moran by renting an apartment across the road from Moran's headquarters and watching the movements of his men. Capone arranged for a phone call on the 13th which told Bugs there was to be a delivery of whiskey from Detroit the following day at a bargain price, so he agreed and asked for the delivery at 10:30 the coming morning at the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where his moonshine operation vehicles were kept. But when the truck arrived, Capone had arranged for a fake police raid to take place by two markswomen dressed in plain clothes and two dressed as Chicago police officers who lined up 7 of Bugs Moran's men against a wall, apparently to search them. But when a signal was given, the men were grown down in cold blood by the cohort's machine ordnance and shotguns. Bugs himself escaped the attack, having slept in that morning despite having been the main target of the mega-hit. But the fallout of the mega-hit for Capone, especially when the photos of the taken victims were published, was a decline in his image and standing with the public, and it also earned him the new surname Public Adversary #1 and led to questions about the felicitousness of his close ties with Thompson, the mayor of Chicago. The exigency services didn't arrive instantly at the scene due to neighbors allowing that the police were formerly in attendance because of the presence of two men dressed as police officers, and once they did arrive, 6 of the men were formerly dead, the one surviving man, Frank Gussenberg, was taken to sanitarium, refusing to identify his killers so as to keep the mobster's law, but he latterly failed. Bugs Moran's response to the complete holocaust of the attack was to break the mobster's law himself and inform the police that it was Capone who arranged the attack. This redounded in a process to court for Capone to answer charges, but he denied all responsibility and claimed he was sick, and so couldn't attend court. This happened doubly, and ultimately the charges were dropped. It seems his tactics had worked. Al Capone was known as someone who let others do his dirty work for him, but one story persists which suggests that this was not always true. This story starts with a regale at a night of drinking for several of Capone's men, including Scalise II and Selmy and Ginter, 3 men who Capone believed had been conspiring against him with another gangbanger, and the story goes to Capone himself beating the men about the head with a baseball club before ordering his men to shoot them. Some chroniclers have questioned the integrity of this story, although it was reported in the journals at the time, and one associate of Capone's claimed to have witnessed both the planning of the attack and the incident itself. During 1929, attempts to bring public adversary number 1 to justice were boosted, and on the 27th of March 1929, FBI agents arrested Capone as he left a courtroom after attesting to a grand jury probing Prohibition law violations. The charge they brought was the pretending of illness, which he would use to avoid earlier execution, and also on the 16th of May 1929, Capone was arrested again when in Philadelphia on a charge of carrying a concealed armament. This time he was transferred to trial and set up shamefaced, and entered a judgment of 1 time in captivity on the 8th of August 1929. Capone was transferred to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, and he was released in March 1930, but in April 1930 Capone was coming arrested on megrim charges whilst visiting Miami Beach, as the governor had ordered that he should be expelled from the state, and during his arrest Capone claimed that the police had hovered his family with arrest and refused him food and water. He was also further charged with perjury for making these claims, but after a 3-day trial in July he was set up not shamefaced. In September, a court judge issued a leave for Capone's arrest on charges of megrim formerly again, and the judge also stood against Thompson in the Democratic primary election, making good use of the hype he'd stirred up to foster votes, and in February 1931. Capone faced another trial, this time on the charge of disdain of court due to his illness claims, and Judge James Herbert Wilkinson made a point of questioning further the evidence of Capone's croaker, therefore abetting the prosecutor, and Capone was doomed to 6 months in captivity, but remained free for the time being as he'd appealed the decision. The law was trying every which way to bring Capone to justice when Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrand realized that there may be another way. She saw that the luxurious cultures of the gangsters must be backed up by a substantial income, yet she honored that they no way filed income duty returns, and so Mabel came up with the idea of executing the hoodlums for tax avoidance. That way they could be indicted without the actual trouble of gaining a declaration there are other unlawful deeds and vicious wrongdoings. Thus she evaluated this methodology on account of U.S. versus Manley Sullivan, an unlawful peddler, and the result of the case was that Equity Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. found that illicitly procured pay ought to be dependent upon personal expense, and the request of the Fifth Correction to safeguard crooks from revealing unlawful pay was invalid. After this, the Inside Income Administration, or IRS, picked Candid J. Wilson to research Capone's duty matters. Yet in addition, his legal counselors had been requested by Capone to get his tank's position into great request. Thus they pronounced pay that was available for 1928 and 1929 of $100,000 for every year, and as he hadn't paid charge on that sum, the statement was active, a confirmation of responsibility, etc. The 13th of Walk 1931, Capone was accused of personal assessment of old for the extended period of 1924, and on the 5th of June Capone was prosecuted by a government fabulous jury to stand preliminary on 22 counts of personal tax avoidance from 1925 to 1929, and he was by then delivered on bail of $50,000. 7 days after this, Elliot Ness of his group would become associated with the court cycle, and their proof prompted Capone's prosecution on 5,000 infringement of the Volstead Act. The demonstration, which point by point the disallowance regulations. To be sure, Elliot Ness is one of the names inseparably connected to Al Capone. He was an American denial specialist in Chicago, head of his group of solid, more white than white policing known as the Untouchables, and with a standing as a morally sound, even energetic upholder of the law. He appeared to be untempered by the payoffs and unaffected by the terrorizing that the Chicago outfit endeavored to get him with, and you might say he was the specific inverse of Al Capone. Ness was an individual from the U.S. Depository Division, which he participated in 1926, working inside the Department of Preclusion in Chicago. Thus, Ness was essential for the group whose work it was to bring down Al Capone by researching his unlawful smuggling exercises and assembling proof of connivance to disregard the public disallowance of Alstead Act. Moreover, Ness impelled strikes of Capone's unlawful stills and breweries, obliterating his store network and prompting an expected deficiency of $9 million in pay for Capone toward the finish of their examinations, helping quite a bit of their data through wiretaps on telephone lines. The activity headed by Ness made a significant monetary and disturbance Capone's activity and gathered proof for the 5,000 infringement of the Volstead Act that he would be taken a stab at on the 16th of June 1931. Capone remained under the watchful eye of Judge James Herbert Wilkinson, a similar adjudicator who had indicted Capone's sibling Ralph for tax avoidance in 1930 and detained him for a long time. This time, Al Capone conceded to annual tax avoidance and furthermore to the 5,000 infringement of the Volstead go-about as a feature of a request deal bargain in which he consented to concede he returned for a sentence of more than 2 years anyway. When it came to condemning, adjudicator Wilkinson wouldn't respect the supplication deal, and on the 30th of July in 1931, Capone's guidance withdrew the blameworthy requests, and a contention was made that a legal counselor couldn't admit for his client, contending that the legal advisors conceded the pay and not Capone, but rather Judge Wilkinson overruled the protest because any assertion made to an administration official was finished at the individual's own gamble. Thus, Judge Wilkinson decided that the last option to government specialists conceding pay could be conceded into proof by Capone's legal counselor, while Curson consequently gave Capone a shot. The annual tax avoidance charges alone, considering them to outweigh the Volstead Act restriction-based charges, and the legal counselors representing Capone had just hours to get ready for the preliminary, as they had been depending on the appointed authority tolerating the supplication deal bargain and thought of the protection that all his pay had been lost in view of his betting propensity. Moreover, the safeguard was feeble. Most definitely not exclusively were betting misfortunes just permissible as a derivation from betting rewards. However, Capone's costs showed that cash probably been accessible to pay for themselves, and to a degree that was far more prominent than that which they guaranteed. The degree of Capone's spending was illustrated in court exhaustively, and the charge was that $215,000 in charges had been dodged on a net pay of $1,038,654 north of a long-term period, etc. The 31st of October, 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 3 counts of personal tax avoidance, and after 7 days, here is his sentence, which was to be 11 years in government jail and a fine of $50,000 in addition to $7,692 in costs. As well as this, he would likewise be obligated for the $215,000 back charges in addition to premium, yet the sentence for hatred of court would be served simultaneously. Capone's reaction was to enlist a group of Tank's master legal counselors from Washington, and they recorded a writ of habeas corpus which implied that the prisoner must be brought to court to examine on the off chance that the confinement was legitimate. The grounds they utilized for their contention was a high court deciding which had articulated that Tank's avoidance was not misrepresentation, which would imply that as far as possible for the indictment of tax avoidance could have lapsed on a portion of the Tank's years he was indicted. For yet the adjudicator concluded that the time Capone had spent in Miami ought to be deducted from the age of the offenses, suggesting the case invalid and subsequently denying the interest for both the conviction and the sentence following the bond bid. Capone was shipped off Atlanta U.S. prison on the 3rd of May 1932 at 33 years old. Besides, Elliot Ness was among the bureaucratic specialists who went with Capone from the Cook Province prison to the prison, and this was the main time that the 2 men were known to have really met face to face, and when Capone showed up there he weighed 250 pounds, and at the clinical he was determined to have both syphilis and gonorrhea as well as a punctured nasal septum because of unreasonable cocaine use. Furthermore, he was additionally experiencing withdrawal side effects from cocaine, to which he was addicted. Whilst in Atlanta, Capone was competent in his job of suturing soles onto shoes, but he wasn't popular with fellow convicts who felt he was both a weak personality, unfit to deal with the bullying the other convicts carried out, and also was entering special treatment. This idea arose from the protection he was offered by his cellmate Red Radensky, a seasoned miscreant who was associated with the Southside Gang, and so with the abomination he was facing from other convicts the Inca sounds of The latter's he was riding home, as well as Red Rodensky's enterprises that he'd have a breakdown. It was decided that Capone would be moved to the reopened Alcatraz Civil Penitentiary off the seacoast of San Francisco in August 1934. His new address was to be Cell 181 in Alcatraz on the 23rd of June. 1936. Capone was attacked in the laundry area by fellow captured James Creature Tan Lucas, who was serving a life judgment for bank thievery. Lucas picked Capone in the reverse with a brace of scissors stolen from the captivity hairstylist, but Capone was only superficially wounded, and so he was suitable to throw Lucas against a wall in retribution. After the attack, Lucas was transferred into solitary confinement as a discipline. During his time at Alcatraz, Capone's syphilis worsened, affecting his internal faculties until in February 1938 he was diagnosed formally with syphilis of the brain, and so the final time of his Alcatraz judgment was spent in the sanitarium ward to the captivity, where he was both disorientated and confused. And so when he was released from Alcatraz on the 6th of January, 1939, he was incontinently transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California to fulfill his judgment for disdain of court, and as well as this he was given parole on the 16th of November, 1939, when his woman heart failure as a result of apoplexy. He was in his home girdled by his favored bones. After this, a private burial was held in Chicago a week laterally, and he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, but 3 times laterally in 1950. His remains, along with the remains of his father Gabriel and his family Salvatore, were disinterred. Andre entered at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Nonetheless, Vitara heat spread may have stopped with his demise, but the Chicago outfit continued with wide-ranging felonious conditioning similar as loan sharking, gambling, harlotry, political corruption, highway robbery, and murder. Whilst they did not have them an awfully on systematized crime in Chicago, it was the most violent, nice, and important felonious mob in the Midwest, and its reach was as far as Florida and California. Indeed, after his death, Al Capone's legend would live on. His image and characterization used to illustrate the American gangbanger to after generations. He became an iconic figure, and his image endures in flicks and publications to this day. What do you suppose of Al Capone? Was he a ultramodern day Robin Hood, giving the people a taste of what they wanted, or was he a duty dodger, cold thoroughbred killer and gangbanger extraordinaire whose taste with a high life ultimately killed him? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you veritably much for watching. You